Okay, this is your week 3 review where we're now at the halfway point, and I want to go ahead and see how you are making sense of this new information and how it's kind of hopefully conflicting or clashing with some of your previous ideas, and then how you're going to kind of build off that pre-existing knowledge so that you can start doing critical analysis. I just want to remind you that the main point of this class, if you're part of the Justice Academy or a criminal justice major, is that you need to really start thinking about social and political trends and how that influences the criminal justice system, and how laws are made, enacted, and changed based on those interpretations of those social events. Then you're going to start to analyze what we call deviance, which is what leads to crime, or the concept of crime, and how that kind of starts to inform this overall system. And then you also want to be able to see how there's diversity in society and how that impacts the analysis. And then finally, you want to be able to do that within critical theory, that you're able to move beyond kind of these naive, existing kind of ideas that you had before you started studying this class and learning new information, and a lot more, less getting away from opinions and things you find from social media, and seeing that there is more than two sides to every situation, that there's 3, 4, 5, 7, 9, lots of different sides to something, and that you're now starting to identify patterns and structures within that. And structures here are patterns of relationships over time that are built on unequal power, and you're going to see how the court plays that. I just want to remind everybody that the goal of the criminal justice system, again, is not to serve, not to protect, not to find justice, not to find the truth, but they're to close cases. The goal is to close cases. So the inputs into that system are stops, arrests, and charges, and that's what you know typically among police officers. The outputs, or how do we know that the system is closing cases, is that people go to prison, they get out on parole or on probation, and then they're monitored. The loop, obviously, that we see here is that there's repeat offenders, and that's a societal issue, not a closing of cases issue. The dilemma that many of you have identified then is, well, what about people who get caught up in the errors in this process? And that's obviously a big inefficiency of the system that we want to think about constantly. In this week 3, what you're doing is you're now trying to move past the idea that laws is only something that everybody must follow, that applies to everybody equally, that it's out there somewhere in the world, that we can dig it up in our backyard, and you start to see it as something that's now held in social groups. I know that this is not the A answer, so we want to get away from the idea that power is held, but for many of you, you're going to have to start there and start moving away from this idea that it's invisible, or it's somehow outside of everything, to something solid. And this will help you just start to get into that it's actually neither of those things, but this will be a transition point for you. Instead of focusing on the thing, what you want to try to focus on now is the social structure of unequal relationships. How are these formed? How do we see them? How do we know they exist? And then what are the stories that people tell as they experience these unequal relations? You want to start now trying to get even beyond a single view of legality, so that you start to understand that those are socially constructed based on your family, based on your morals, based on your lived experience, and based on your education. And so you want to start to see that you have your own theory of legality that's based in your family, and it might be different. You're going to see that in the student narratives, that some of them have different perspectives than their families. So that's at least 2 there. And then obviously there are families outside of your family, and so now there's multiple, if not hundreds of thousands of different ways of seeing legality. Legality is the way we talk and think about the legal system. And so that's a little bit different than knowledge of a particular law, say the law of homicide that you learned earlier in the semester. Now, you do want to start to use course concepts to identify your own standpoint. Why are you saying the things that you're saying? How does this combine with your lived experience and the new knowledge? And so we want to start to see that. I want to start to see that in the discussion board posts, and then you'll start to be able to see yourself in this legal system. Now, I want to separate in the first reading, the sovereignty and migration. The bummer for me as a professor is that only a couple of you actually read the entire reading. I know it's a long reading, but it was the only long reading this week. And so again, I just want to remind you that as you move forward in this program and as you transfer to John Jay or another four-year university, you're going to have to read a lot of long readings. So I wanted to introduce you to that concept. I also just want to throw it out there is that in order to get it, in order to understand or to get an A in a class, you generally have to do all of the readings the more you move forward. So again, it's tough, but you want to figure out new reading strategies in order to take better notes. And maybe don't read like it's a novel, but start to look for very main points. That's why I gave you the hint over the announcement that you really need to really process and understand the information from the chart and how that relates to the case studies, because that's what's going to be on the final exam. But I do want to see on this left-hand side, you see that students are working it out. And so as they started reading through the first few pages, they started to see that law is not just simply a set of rules that everyone must follow. And they also started to see that the power can fluctuate and it's dynamic depending on where you are. So you might have power in one country, your family, but if you migrate or you move, you might not have that power anymore. And so the one thing that you do want to point out is that when you start seeing this within the system, you'll start to see that this system promotes winners and losers, the legal system. And that's because it's an adversarial system, something we talked about earlier in this class. You also want to start to think about how people who have experience with the legal system are most likely to be rich, they're most likely to be wealthy, and they're going to tend to use the legal system to defend their positions. Again, this is not about finding truth or about serving and protecting. This is about using the legal system in order to maintain their power situation. So you want to think about the fact that power as authority really comes out of the legal system, but it also is attached to the economic system, to religious systems, to other systems that are integrated or connected to the legal system, but that one doesn't come before the other necessarily. But the situations are going to be what create these relationships. And so the legal system doesn't come in until those situations become in conflict or in contrast. And so instead of looking at it from the ideal point of view that a lot of textbooks take, you'll see that these students start to realize, okay, I see that looking up from the bottom of how people without power, how they experience the legal system, is very different than the textbook definition of a set of rules that everybody must follow, and that it doesn't really happen that way. And so you want to understand the real legal system, not the fantasy legal system that would be great in a video game, although probably very boring. You also start to see that how people believe in sovereignty, and sovereignty, the way I would put it for beginning students would be, who do you think should be in charge? So some people think God should be in charge, some people think they should be in charge, some people think the majority should be in charge, some people say the law, and nobody ever knows what that really means. Some people think that the Supreme Court, right? So some people think the police. I'd say in this country it's evident that a majority population believes the police should be in charge, based on what they say in social media and how they behave and how they respond to police brutality. Whereas you see a minority of people are protesting against that unequal power structure. And so what you see there is that people have different ideas on who they think should be in charge. That is going to inform and influence how they see the legal system. And then you're going to start to see that you're going to maybe agree or you're going to disagree with some of these views, and some of you had pretty strong opinions, and that's good. This is now where you're getting to move beyond a single view of legality, and you're starting to see that there's a diversity of experiences. I wanted to point out here is that this is correct, right? And so for those of you who are getting frustrated by this, the idea that the majority population holds, most people in America believe in individual rights. They don't believe in social responsibility. And as you can see is that their belief in an individual rights legal system is what does create a chaotic environment, right? Because they're not thinking about other people, they're thinking about themselves. The problem with what you want to think about there is that they didn't come up with this idea. This is an idea that's been taught to them and that they generally believe is true, that they should have individual rights. People often talk about my rights. And so this is just them exercising this opinion in what they believe to be correct, as some of you identified. But what happens because of this is when people believe that only their social group should have rights, or they think only their belief system should be the one that dominates, then people get excluded. And so what you see here is that under these ideas of sovereignty, where people have the right to make their decisions based on their own individual conceptions, this means that they're able to exclude other people. And again, like if this is a philosophy class or a religion class or even an English class, right, you might want to think about bad and good and whether this is, and those are fine things to think about, but not if you're trying to learn the system of law. In the legal system, it's irrelevant whether it's bad or good. It's just what ends up happening. So people are excluded. Now, the dilemma there is that that's a contradiction. On the one hand, the legal system is supposed to protect everyone, but in reality, it doesn't work that way. And so the big question would be, well, what should we do with this contradiction, the fact that it doesn't work out, rather than thinking about whether it's good that some people are excluded. Certainly people have that view, lots of people have that view, but many of you don't have that view. Many of you believe that no one should be excluded. And so the dilemma for the legal system and for a professor of the legal system is, well, who's supposed to be right? Is the person who believes that some people should be excluded, and that's a good thing, so should they win? Should they be the ones who are in charge and get to make the decision? Or should the people who believe that everyone should be included, should they get to make the decision? Who's supposed to make these decisions? And so you see that the legal system doesn't have an answer to this question. It's just broken it down now into a diversity of experience. And that's why as you start to move to the right of the screen, you start to see a more complicated reality. And so these students are really they're getting there, right? They're starting to understand this process of saying, well, wait a second, under international human rights law, everyone is supposed to have a right to a nationality. So how come there are people who don't, right? I mean, that's the when you're starting to get it, you're starting to say, oh, I see. So this doesn't automatically apply, right? So what's going on here? I want to have a deeper analysis of how there could be people who don't have citizenship. And so one student here is really thinking about this from an ideal perspective. So I really see this going from like the C answer to the B answer, where they're really trying to work it out and they're slowly getting there. Is that for some people, when they leave a state, let's say Kazakhstan, they might have lost their citizenship for a variety of reasons. Or let's say they transition. Let's say they go from Kazakhstan to Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan doesn't recognize their state. And they don't recognize their citizenship, and so now they're stateless. Now let's say they try to get into the United States, and let's say they come here without any paperwork, and then they find a lawyer, and the lawyer is able to grant them the paperwork process to get amnesty, and then they're given their statehood. It's possible, right? It doesn't happen very often. In fact, it rarely happens in that situation. Instead, what you learned about in the reading was that there are millions of people who don't have any citizenship. And this isn't because they're not humans, right? They are humans, and they're guaranteed, there it is in the law, saying that they get to have nationality. The problem is that the governments, the people in the governments, have to actually recognize that law. They have to actually give you the paperwork. So this applies a lot to undocumented people as well, as you'll hear people, uninformed people who are not lawyers, who talk about people getting in line. That you just need to get in line and then you'll get the proper paperwork to get in the United States. That it's not true. It's also a wildly interesting fantasy that there would be some kind of a line that everybody could get in, like you're going to, order a burger and fries. The reality is that you need to have access to a lawyer in the first place, really, in order to have your case go through successfully in immigration. The other issue is that for a variety of reasons, some people are not capable of filling out paperwork, again, because they aren't recognized by their home governments. And so there's no way to verify their identity, for example. Now, again, this is not good or bad. That's something for a non-lawyer to think about. This is just what on earth is the legal system going to do with these situations. And so what they do is they try to look to governments to try to form policies and processes that allow lawyers to come in and help people get this. But the reality is that that's not happening, right? And so people remain stateless because of government inaction. And that's largely also the reason why people remain undocumented in the United States. There's lots of people with lots of opinions about undocumented immigrants today, but all you'd have to do is look back into the 1980s under a concept called amnesty, when it was Congress who created a process for people to get paperwork. So it is possible for the government to do this, but they're choosing not to. largely because it helps them win re-election campaigns, not just in the United States, but also in Hungary and other countries. So you start to see that there's a political and social kind of competition here, where people can start to use the law in ways that you wouldn't have thought when you were in that D&C idea, where you thought that it was applied to everybody and it was automatic. And then you start to see over here to the right, you get students starting to see that the law is malleable, and that power is exercised in a way that reinforces dominant legal narratives, and you start to see this gap forming. And then now you're going to see that this is also influencing the whole system, including the criminal system. And so what you'll start to see is that people are going to have different definitions of who we the people are. So, for example, in the Capitol 6th insurrection, they said, the people have been let down by the political system. They didn't mean everybody in the United States. They meant them and who they believe are the people. And so there's a very us versus them kind of idea. And this goes back to the concept of prisoner's dilemma, the winners and losers. And so what you really need to be able to understand from this reading is really a few major concepts. The very kind of thing I think everybody, this is like common sense, right, is that in most cultures definitely favor the rich over the poor within any given scenario. So that's like where you should be starting. And then you want to see how does that influence the legal system, and how does that influence people's ideas about the legal system? And so just start with your own social group, right? Are you a social group that tends to give, let's call it deference or power or prestige to rich people, and that's what you aspire to? Or are you in a social group that doesn't think rich people are that great and you think there's other values? Or are you somewhere in between? This will influence your own ideas about sovereignty. And so are you from a family or a social group that tends to view majority rules, right? This is what you think is important, and that's what democracy is. Are you a family that tends to think about, no, the individual with property should be protected because they're, the ideal citizen, as John Locke called them? Or are you of the mindset and social group that the powerful make all the rules and there's not anything you can do about it but follow them? So you have to understand that these three ideas are in competition because these groups are in competition over material resources and also our social relations, who gets authority, who gets to make decisions. And so in this concept, the majority rules are up against the law, right? Because it's good advice, but it's not required. You don't have to follow the law if it contradicts your own personal beliefs. And that's where some of you get, kind of frustrated, because this mixes in then with individuals with rights. The dilemma is that individual rights can come into contrast with the second group, which is individual property with law. So you really, this is a social compact and a moral duty. So this is where it's confusing to me when students say, without law there would be chaos, because that would be true if you have property. If you are a property holder and you have rights that say that you get to hold your property, and then the police will come defend you if somebody tries to take your property, then that's how you're defining chaos. Chaos in that sense would be that you don't have the stability and predictability of your property. If you don't have property, then you're really outside the social compact, and you don't have a moral duty to follow it, objectively speaking. You could still believe subjectively that you want that, and that's a good thing, and many people obviously do that, but it starts to become against your interest at a certain point. And then the third group, the subjects before the law, this is a lot of people used to believe this, but it's becoming less consequential, and it's a historical position, and so people tend to believe that you should just obey the law, or there'll be violent consequences. What's interesting here is that you see this kind of conflict forming, right? Because you've got the powerless are subjected to domination and violent consequences, and so they start to lose their rights. And yet when they try to express themselves within individual rights, let's say in the Black Lives Matter movement, they had the individual right not to be shot by police when they're unarmed. This viewed from other people as saying, well, you're not in the majority, and so we don't have to take, this is good advice that you're giving, but we don't have to take this into consideration. We don't have to protect you. And then individuals with property see this as like, well, this is disorder, and you're threatening my property value. And so you see these different kind of ideas coming into clash with each other because law means different things to different people based on their experience and their social position. And so that also then goes the other way around. It's not just the way you feel, it's also how people are treated. So modern working class and rich people tend to believe in the first idea of sovereignty, that if they're in the majority, then they'll get the benefit of the law. But if it doesn't benefit them, that they don't really need to follow the law. They'll try to change the law, and they believe that this power is granted to them because they're in the majority, and that the minority just has to go along with it. So in that case, right, minority has to follow the law. They must comply, but the majority doesn't. They have the power to change the law. This is largely what you learned in your American government class, whether you realized it or not, is that, if people don't like the law, then they can change the law. So think about how that goes up against your kind of D-level answer in the first week, that law is something that everybody has to follow. That's not true, and it's certainly not true in a democratic society. And these people tend to label people stateless, undocumented, or legal, largely because they're not in the majority. So they don't have any rights. And again, because not everybody has to follow the law the same way. The modern middle class tends to believe in this kind of second level individual rights and property rights being balanced, and they see this as a social contract. And so they tend to label the same people, right? So they're still stateless, undocumented, and surplus, meaning they're outside of the majority. They label them differently. They say, no, these are refugees, immigrants, and these will become citizens. And so this is what you saw in the last slide, where a student is obviously representing that modern middle class belief system, is that, well, if people can get the right paperwork and they can contribute and they're part of the moral contract, then they get to be labeled. And the label is what allows them to start to have some rights. Now, they don't have full rights, but they have some rights. In other words, they have some individual rights, but they don't have the same level of rights as those with property. And then again, just to remind you, there was the historical position where everyone are subjects. They're all subject to the law. We even have that language sometimes in the law because it's from ancient England. And it's still this idea that everyone should be entitled to the same rights. But there's no leader anymore. There's no king to actually enforce this law. And probably it was never that equal to begin with, but there is still that concept that people say that we should all be equal before the law. Now, the dilemma then becomes that we're in a winner versus loser system. And so you played the prisoner's dilemma game to see that you can't win unless basically, you have to go against your instinct to cooperate, and you have to defect. And this is the general idea, is again that what people get confused about this is they say, well, humans are selfish. Well, this isn't true. What prisoner's dilemma game shows us is that when people can play together, they cooperate more. So it's only when they don't have information and they are just meeting each other for the first time, or it's the first round of the game, that's the only time where they defect. Over time, they start to cooperate again. And so what's fascinating about this is one student asked this really great important question. If people are more likely to cooperate and they're more likely to get along with each other, then why do police have guns, right? And the answer is because the legal system, the criminal justice system, both, those aren't cooperative games. Those are competitive winner-loser games. And so you can go into a lot of theory about this if you wanted to think about it, but it's the difference between the systems, right, between the games. If it was a cooperative game, then you wouldn't need police at all. But because it's a competitive game, then you need the police in order to punish, right, the losers. And so again, this reminds you that the system's goal, the goal of the legal system and the criminal justice system, is not to help everybody get along. That's not the system's goal. The system's goal is to close cases. So there's the social role of police that we've created. Here's this costume, put this on, here's this gun, and then go out and find the deviants, go out and find these bad guys. And so we've created this game, right, as a social construction. We said this is what we want. It's not natural. It doesn't exist in nature. We created it. Now, for students most students weren't able to understand this distinction, that once you create an outside, once you create a game in which there are outsiders, there are quote-unquote bad guys, you need to understand the difference between distinction and actual difference. And so how you perceive the system is going to influence your ideas and how you think you should behave in that system, whether you think you should cooperate or defect. And so again, the system is designed in a certain way that goes against your natural interests and goes against your natural desire to cooperate. And so you should really keep that in mind about why there's so many problems and why there's wrongful conviction and why innocent people get thrown in jail, is because the game is not to find truth, it's not to find the good guys, it's to find bad guys. And so they close cases when they quote unquote found a bad guy, whether that person is a bad guy or not. And so again, this is the way that the system is organized. Now, I then wanted you to kind of get it, and a couple students really did pick up on this, is then I wanted you to think, well, so then what's the legal system game like? And in my mind, the legal system game is like a maze, right? So if the policing system is like Prisoner's Dilemma, where it's cooperate or defect, the legal system is like a maze that you have to get through. I want to just, this was really great. This is the first time I've tried this one in this class, in the legal system class, and there's really great questions and comments that came from this. So I'm really happy that this provoked this kind of inquiry. So I just want to kind of start over here in the upper top part. What the student really got from this, which is great, right? Because this is what I intended, is that on the one hand, there's this like system that's pretty cut and clear. If you were to look at a diagram in a textbook, right, is that you've got this judge, then the judge gets appealed, and then there's another appeal process. Now, one thing that you should know that is interesting, that most of you didn't know this, so I just want to make sure you do know this, is that this is not always the case. In fact, the Supreme Court can hear cases without them going through any other level. So these are called cases of first impression, and they're able to do it. And if you look at Article 3 of the United States Constitution, it'll tell you what cases they're allowed to hear in that situation. A famous case is Marbury versus Madison. But in general, most of the time, it goes through this appeals process. Now, most cases don't go through the appeals cases. Let's start there. Most cases get closed at the first level, at the judge level. But some cases get appealed, and those are because those are appealed on a basis of law, meaning that the person believes that the judge made a mistake, and that the three judges now are going to look at the case to see whether the judge made a mistake. They're not going to look at the case to see whether it was right or wrong. They're looking at it, did the judge make a mistake, yes or no? If the judge didn't make a mistake, then that's the end of it. If they change the decision, so let's say judge says you win, the other side appeals, and they said, no, the judge made a mistake of law. The three judges say, we agree with you, we agree with the other person, and so now you lose. Now you're obviously going to want to appeal to the Supreme Court, but you can only appeal based on that mistake that they believe that the judge made. And so that's what you're appealing to. So again, it's not about the whole case, it's about this part of the process, or the procedure, if you will, that the judge either did or didn't do correctly. You're not going to be able to learn all of that in a 6-week express course at Kingsborough Community College. But if you're interested in that, you should be going to law school, or you'd be studying law and society at John Jay, and you'll start to look at what are these procedures that judges follow. Most of the time they have to do with evidence or a principle of law that is open to interpretation. So there's lots of principles. The totality of circumstances is a common one among criminal justice majors. And so does that apply in a particular situation? Did the judge follow the procedure correctly? Did they admit the evidence correctly? Things like that. Now, the next level of this, which is getting not just about what cases the court can hear and how they deal about, is I wanted to present the social dilemma, right? So we have these different groups. So now I'm trying to take the ideas from the previous slides in the first 2 weeks, and now we're going to put them in the legal system. So you start to see the legal system is embedded in the social system. So what's interesting is that you start to see, and I do like this lower left-hand comment where I didn't intend for this to be this way, where you had this kind of lower power position of immigrants and women or non-binary folk, but that is accurate. That's a very good observation, that there is a dual hierarchy going on here. There's not just the hierarchy of the judge to the three judges to the Supreme Court, but there's also a hierarchy of the jury and how that's composed of people. Now, most juries are composed of middle-class white men. And so, because wealthy white men can get out of jury duty. And so, however, in New York, you might see a different composure, right? So it might be more representative in New York City, and probably Chicago and other majority cities. In other words, where the majority of people in the city are from minoritized backgrounds. But across the country, on average, most juries are white middle-class men. And so I put these three concepts up against the law, before the law, and with the law that you're learning about. And as you can see, I put these with colors so that you could start to see this is not how, like, wealthy white men do not have to view the law this way. Same thing with middle class folks or these African Americans, for example. This is just, this is how they tend to, according to the research. And so my job is to get this idea out there to you, and your job is to think about why this is. So you see this in the middle, kind of towards the right column, these really good questions, right? And the issues, then I just want to like deepen the question to say, how do we go about thinking about what a criminal injustice is for a poor white man? I say that because you could go a lot of different directions for that, and then you've got this other perspective where someone's talking about who suffers more, immigrants or African Black Americans. And so these are good questions. These are questions that now you're thinking about the how of criminal justice and the legal system, as opposed to the good, bad, perfect world reality. The interesting thing I just want to put out is that, again, we want to get away from the idea of the ideal and get to the reality. So I give you a link here, is that the reason why wealthy white men tend to use the legal system to their benefit is in a great article called "Why the Haves Come Out Ahead" by Mark Gallanter, and he explains it's not like desire, although it could be, right? But what turns out to be is that it's just their experience. They have so much experience with the legal system, usually through their business holdings, that they're then able to view it as a game and use it that way over time in almost every situation. And so those people who are most experienced with the legal system are most likely to come out as winners in the system. So if you think about all the people on the left-hand side, they're less likely to have that kind of experience. They're less likely to be represented by a wealthy lawyer. They're less likely to be able to afford a wealthy lawyer. And so that's why I kind of put these two big orange circles. The largest majority of people in the United States are middle-class folks with an education, at least a high school education. And so you want to start thinking about, they're on both sides. It's less often that immigrants, women, non-binary, and African Americans who have experienced injustice were able to become winners in the legal system, again, when you look at the data. So it's not that it's impossible. Some do argue, by the way, that it is impossible. But and I'll leave it open as a professor. I'll say it's possible that people can win in the legal system, even if they don't have access. But you have to try to remember that these people have already experienced the injustice. So the legal system has already failed them. The criminal justice system has already failed them. So the social system has already failed them. The economic system has already failed them. And so it would be kind of silly, naive, to believe that the legal system is going to somehow fix all those other problems. And in fact, in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court said it's not for the legal system to solve these social problems, right? And so, again, you can agree that maybe that's not good, right? It would be better if maybe it could, but in reality it doesn't. And so you want to think about it that way. Now, in the right-hand corner, I just wanted to highlight that this is an interesting conversation forming, and that people are, taking this visual, right? There's just this visual information here, and they're starting to be able to compose concepts and ideas about the legal system, which is really the goal this week. And so then that leads you into the pretty long PowerPoint. It's one of the longer PowerPoints, but I wanted to try to cover a lot of information that we'd probably go through in like 3 or 4 classes if we were in person. And so maybe take some breaks as you're watching it. You're going to want to come back to that PowerPoint video on YouTube before the final exam, and maybe take it in sessions. And you really want to start to try to memorize and apply this learning, and then spend some time critically reflecting, talking about it with your friends and family. And then obviously what I'm really hoping for is that I start to see this content, I start to see these ideas, that you understand this onto the discussion board. So I just wanted to point out what I thought this last week was really great. I really like that you guys are calling each other by your names, you're building on your concepts, and you're starting to address some of the major issues. And then what I was hoping that I'd see, I didn't see a lot of it, but hopefully I'll see it more this next week, is that you start to talk about unequal power and how that's constructed, and that it's not just about a command, that there's also other ways of exercising power based on your social position. That you'll start to think about how that then relates to your idea of who should be in charge. That's what sovereignty is. And then what you think about your position about the legal system is, that's legality. And then start to theorize. And one of those theories is to start to understand the prisoner's dilemma, that the system controls behavior. So if we had a legal system that promoted restoration or restitution or conflict resolution or mediation, that would be more cooperative. But we don't. We have an adversarial system that promotes winners and losers, and that coincides with the criminal justice system, which is also promoting winners and losers. And then finally, just to understand that there's a wide diversity of opinions about what the legal system is and how it's experienced by different people. So you want to start to be able to contrast your own beliefs to the beliefs of others, and to start that understand there's a tension between law as social control, as a command, but there's also this abuse of that command, and that's what leads to the concept of rights. And so there's this tension in that system, or duality is what other people talk about. Control on the one hand and freedom on the other hand. And then finally, this coming up in week 4, I'm really hoping that you can start to show me what you're understanding. You're going to get 2 very similar readings, one from Professor Chapman about policing in the courts, and then one from myself about immigration in the courts, which also applies to healthcare. And you'll start to see that both the social problems, police brutality, and the immigration problems are products partly of the court system and those procedures and the way that judges operate. And so you start to see that these social problems can also be manufactured, produced, constituted by the judicial system. They're not solved, right? Many of us think, oh, the legal system is going to solve these problems. In fact, what you'll see from those 2 readings is no, they can create more problems. And so you want to go back to this idea of it's because there's not one view of the legal system, at least not since we've had a king. Then you really want to start to be thinking about your self-grading. And so I'll just help you. Most of you are here in this pink needs revision category, and some of you are still saying some of these things. And so you've got to be able to move towards the yellow and the green boxes here to start to understand that the start with the system, right? It's to close cases. And so courts are there to resolve those cases that didn't get closed by the criminal justice system. Avoid thinking about right or wrong until you get that understanding. Then start to understand that police are out hunting crimes, right? They're trying to find people to put into the system because that's their job. It's not to prevent, it's not to stop, it's to catch and put people in. And then the court system is there to finalize that process. That means that the outside ideas, right, you've got the social control versus the individual rights. Those are what create the malleability of law, how it gets changed, because you've got lawyers in an adversarial system that are using principles from previous cases to argue their points, and so they're arguing against each other. Now, that's going to really come out based on your power and your own lived experience, and how you've experienced the legal system is going to influence how much power you have, just like your social power. How you've experienced social power and unequal power in your life is going to influence what you want the criminal justice and the legal system to do. And so you want to start to put all these pieces together and to be able to understand this is the whole system, as imperfect and problematic as it is, right? And so it's not going to fix itself, and some of the things are not fixable. And so you need to start to accept that reality in order to do well in your criminal justice and legal system classes.